Hey everybody, welcome to what's going to pass on my channel for a review of Fallout Shelter. I say it's going to pass for a review because this isn't really a game that can be reviewed in a traditional sense, because it doesn't really have an ending. It has arbitrary quests that have basically nothing to do with anything, and the entire gameplay loop is not really gameplay per se. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment, but first some information about the game itself. This was developed by Bethesda Game Studios and Behavior Interactive, and of course published by Bethesda, and it was originally an Android and iOS game that released in 2015, and it eventually saw release on PC, Xbox One, PS4, and Nintendo Switch. What you're seeing here is the Switch version. You may ask, why the Switch version specifically? Well, to put it quite simply, I more or less ended up doing the same thing with this that I did with the Elder Scrolls Blades, in that I mostly just messed around with this while other things were happening, while I was waiting for things to compile, or I was waiting for things to install, or whatever the case may be. Or, frankly, much more often, I would just need to take a dump and needed something to occupy my mind, and I didn't feel like reading something, so I would take my Switch and I would mess around with Fallout Shelter while I was taking a dump, which is about how long it would take to actually do anything that needed to be done in the game. Honestly, I'm pretty hesitant to even call it a game, but that'll become more clear once I really start talking about the gameplay. First, let me talk about the presentation, which is fine. There's nothing really wrong with it. It runs in Unity, it runs fine on the Switch. Presumably it'll run fine on just about anything you try to run it on, so there's not really anything to complain about there. The characters themselves are all 2D images, but the environments are sort of 3D. It takes place from a side perspective, and there is some degree of depth in the environments, but it doesn't really factor into anything that's actually going on. And while obviously if you scale up the resolution to match 1080p displays and such, it really doesn't look all that great, it doesn't look bad either, and certainly on a smaller screen like the Switch in handheld mode, or obviously something like a phone, it all looks fine. It's basically the same aesthetics you saw in Fallout 4, so if you're familiar with how that game looks, all of the stuff in this will look pretty familiar to you, only most of what you're going to be dealing with is 2D, and it's nothing to write home about. The interface does take some getting used to, and I did notice that it does seem to work quite a bit better as either a mouse interface or obviously a touchscreen interface, because trying to get things to work using the controller for the Switch, when I had to record this thing by docking it and then using something like my Switch Pro controller, it ended up being a bit clunky, and it didn't always work exactly the way I was really hoping it would. It does work fine with the touch controls, and it does also work fine if you use the mouse on the PC version, which I was able to confirm when I messed around with the PC version briefly when I was making my April Fool's video for 2020. So the visuals all more or less work fine, only the interface is a bit clunky if you're using anything other than touchscreen controls or using the mouse in the PC version. As far as the sound design goes, there's really not a whole lot to talk about there. There is very little music in the game, and the sound effects, while certainly functional, are definitely nothing to write home about. So presentation-wise, there's really not a whole lot going on here, and that leads us over into what passes for a story in this game and the gameplay. And the story in this game is that you are a vault overseer. Build out your vault, provide for your dwellers, and occasionally send them out in the wasteland to complete some quests or just to explore. That's it. There is nothing else to the so-called story of this game. The only thing else that kind of passes for story are the various quest lines that involve a very brief bit of dialogue occasionally, but it never actually ends up going anywhere, and while there are rewards to be gained from the various quests, of course, there's not really anything interesting going on in those quests. There's not even any good humor in the thing, so they end up just being pretty dull all around. So there's really not much going on in the writing department at all, but what about the gameplay? Well, that's where I hesitate to even call this a game. There are really only 3 things you can do in this thing. The first is building out the vault, which is to say, you go into a menu, you select whatever structure you want to build, then you select where you want to build it in the vault, and that's pretty much it. You can expand some of the structures to where they start out with just one slot, and then you can add another instance of the same structure next to it that will expand it to 2 slots. Then you can do that again for an expansion up to 3 slots, although sometimes you'll have structures that do take up multiple slots right from the get-go, so you need to keep that in mind when you're building things out. You don't need to worry about adjacency bonuses or floor bonuses or anything like that, because it doesn't matter where you build things as long as you build them and they become functional. As your vault's population continues to grow, you will unlock new things to build, and these can range from just upgraded versions of the resource production buildings, as well as things that can produce equipment and outfits, as well as things that will improve the stats of your various dwellers, things that improve your storage capacity for junk items as well as weapons and outfits, and of course living areas for your vault to expand its population. Once you've built something, then you can also go and upgrade it, which requires a large number of caps, which is the in-game currency that you earn from just exploring the wasteland, for completing quests, for opening lunchboxes, which I'll get to in a moment, and you'll also get small amounts of them whenever someone levels up, or whenever you complete a rushed action on a resource-producing structure, without some catastrophic failure resulting in a shutdown of the production entirely until you manage to get whatever that situation is under control. Whenever you upgrade a resource-producing structure, your storage capacity of that resource as well as that facility's production capacity increases, and if it's one of the facilities that you can expand by adding additional versions of the same structure next to it, then its capabilities are enhanced even further if you build it out all the way. Some of the structures can also have themes applied to them. These are things you will unlock by finding blueprints for them in the wasteland or on quests, and once you've collected all of the blueprints for a given theme, then you can construct that theme for a particular structure, and it will just change the appearance. It doesn't actually change the output or anything like that. And as you continue to build out structures, the cost for building some of the same structures you already have will gradually increase, eventually getting to the point where it becomes kind of prohibitively expensive to keep expanding the vault. Thing is, by the time your vault population gets high enough to where you've unlocked all of the structures, you're not going to need to build anything else anyway, so there's not really any point to continuing to build out the vault past a certain point. And the vault will become pretty self-sufficient very quickly, so you don't really need to worry about upgrading things all that much either, except for pretty early on when you don't have access to the more efficient structures. This leads me into the next thing that you can mess around with, which is the resource production itself. And what I mean by that is that every single resource production facility in your vault has a timer. Once that timer expires, then whatever that resource is ready to be picked up, and it will be added to your resource stores. And the way you do that is by selecting the particular resource production facility and either pressing the A button if you are using the gamepad controls, or if you are using the mouse or you're just tapping on the screen, then you just need to tap on whatever facility it is and it will collect the resource, and that production facility will get right back to producing more of that particular resource. Each resource production facility has a governing stat, so in the case of, say, the cafeteria, it's agility. If you assign dwellers to it with a high agility, they will reduce the amount of time it takes for that cycle to complete. Same thing goes for all of the other production facilities, all of which have their own governing stats. The more dwellers you add to a particular resource production facility, and the higher their stat value for the governing stat of that facility, the faster it will produce resources. If you want to improve the stat values of your dwellers, then you can send them to training facilities once you've unlocked them anyway, and then they will be on a timer for whenever it will gradually increase their stats. Eventually they will hit the maximum value in a given stat, and then you'll have to either move them to some other training facility to train up a different stat, or you'll move them to the production facility that you were probably planning on putting them in the first place. The time it takes to improve that particular stat will also increase as that stat increases, so once they start getting into the highest levels of that particular stat, it will take a very, very long time to actually level up that stat. You can upgrade the training facilities so that they will reduce the amount of time this takes, but it will still take a very long time once that dweller gets to higher stat values, so it is something to keep keep in mind. Producing outfits and weapons is more or less done the same way, except that in order to start production on one of those items, you need to select whatever the item is you want to produce, and you need to have however many junk items in your inventory that are specified on that blueprint. And once you've selected the blueprint, the dwellers in that particular workshop will go ahead and start working on it, and it will take several hours to finish production. Once the production is finished, you can pick up that weapon or outfit like you would with any other resource, and then you can assign it to one of your dwellers. The dwellers can all be equipped with an outfit, as well as a weapon and a pet. The outfits each have corresponding stats that they'll increase that particular dweller's stat levels by, while the weapons are all pretty self-explanatory there. They are used to deal damage to enemies, which you will encounter in two forms. Either you will encounter them while you're on quests, and I'll get to that more in a moment, or you will encounter them when they raid your vault and you have to fight them off. This is done by either stationing some guards at the vault door, or by just letting the raiders show up and just start running through your facilities, and anybody who's in their path will just start fighting them. And whenever you get raided by either raiders themselves or death claws or whatever, they will show up, they will just start fighting things, and you have no control over the combat that ensues. The only thing you can do is apply Radaway or stim packs to your injured dwellers, and that's done with just a quick press of a button. Eventually, the raiders will be defeated, and then you'll be able to either loot their corpses, or they might just disappear. It depends on what type of raiders they are, and your vault will resume production as normal, although you do have to keep in mind that as long as your vault currently has enemies in it, you will be gradually losing some of your resource stocks, so you need to be careful to make sure that you don't run out of resources, especially early on in the game. Once you get later on and you basically are producing way more than you actually need, you really don't need to worry about that anymore. Occasionally, instead of your vault just being raided from forces by the outside, they will have forces tunnel up from the ground, which are either going to be things like rad scorpions or mole rats, and they'll just show up in one of your rooms, and whoever's currently in that room will just start fighting them. Much like when the vault is raided, you don't have any control over this combat either, and you just have to wait for things to play out. You can, of course, still apply stim packs and Radaway if you need to, but that's really all you can do in those instances. As such, it should be pretty obvious that you need to make sure that all of your vault dwellers are equipped with weapons of some description, even if it is the simplest of weapons that you happen to have. Because otherwise, every single combat they get involved in is just going to be dragged out to a ridiculous degree, because fists only do 1 damage, whereas the weapons all do a wide variety of damage depending on what particular weapon it is, and what rarity of that weapon you currently have. There are 3 rarity types. There are common, then there are rare, and then there are legendary. Obviously, the higher rarity it is, the better stats it's going to have, and the same thing goes for all the outfits as well. They operate on the same rarity system. And a lot of the legendary items in particular need to be crafted. So you need to find the crafting blueprints for them, and then you need to collect the resources for them, and then you need to spend a long time producing them. That's of course once you've upgraded your workshops to the highest level, which is ridiculously expensive. And by that I mean the weapons workshop is 60,000 caps, and the outfit shop is 90,000 caps. And keep in mind that for quest rewards, at best you're looking at around 2,000 or so caps as a reward. This of course brings me to talking about the quests themselves, because we've already gone over basically everything there is to know about running the vault, but what about the quests themselves? Well, you'll select a team of up to 3 dwellers to send on a quest, and you need to make sure they're all equipped, of course, and they all have stim packs and Radaway with them so they can be healed on the journey. And once those dwellers arrive in the quest location, then you are given a map that is similar to what you see with the vault, only you have to explore it 1 room at a time, and as you progress through the rooms, you will gradually find items that you can pick up and then haul back to the vault, as well as enemies to fight, and this is where you do actually get some degree of control over the combat. You can of course do the same thing you can when combat erupts in the vault, which is to apply stim packs and Radaway to your dwellers if need be, but you can also order your dwellers to target specific enemies, and occasionally an indicator will pop up on the screen, and if you select it and press A, or if you just tap on it, then it will pause the game effectively and bring up a sort of quick time event, where if you tap the button at the right time, then it will increase the amount of damage that the next attack is going to do. The closer the arrows are to the center of the crosshair, the higher damage modifier it's going to apply. The game effectively uses this as its critical hit system, and it's only available in the quests. It never happens in vault combat, which would actually be a nice thing to have, because particularly death claws can be damage sponges. The air quotes difficulty of a particular quest is going to be indicated by what level the quest requires its dwellers to be, as well as how much damage output it demands of them, both of which are lined out on the quest's descriptions themselves. And you also might have some additional requirements, like it might need a particular outfit or a particular weapon for the quest to be doable. Regardless, the quests all basically play out the exact same way. Your team shows up, you go through the entire wherever it is, and you explore every room. Eventually, you will find whatever the objective for that particular quest is and complete it. Usually, it's defeating a particular enemy. Sometimes it's just showing up, finding someone to talk to, and talking to them for really no effect whatsoever, and then returning to the vault. Either way, once you've completed a quest, then it's time to return to the vault, and then you're put on another timer. You were put on a timer to get there, and you're put on another timer to get back. Once your team gets back, they unload all of their ill-gotten gains, and you can either apply them to other production facilities, or you can send them right back out on another quest, or of course you can send them into the wasteland to explore, in which case it's similar to the quests themselves, except you have no control over it whatsoever. You give them some stim packs, you give them some RadAway, and then you send them on their way, and everything from then on out is randomly generated. They'll find random items, they'll find random enemies, they'll get a random amount of experience points, and if they happen to die, then you can revive them using caps. And you can do the same thing when dwellers are out on a quest. And that's it. That's the entire game. I have described every single thing you do in this game. You will click on things, you will tap on things, and ultimately there is basically no point to this so-called game whatsoever. The only time they try to shake things up is when the mysterious stranger shows up in your vault and you can find him to get some extra caps, which is completely randomized. Sometimes it's a lot of caps, sometimes it's barely any caps at all. It just depends. And once your vault starts getting really big, it gets increasingly difficult to find the mysterious stranger, so you're probably not going to end up worrying about it too much after a certain point. And now that I've described the whole game, you may be wondering to yourself, well, DW, this is a free-to-play mobile game, so how are they ruining it by using microtransactions? Well, weirdly enough, they haven't really shoved the microtransactions in there as intrusively as you might expect for a free-to-play mobile game. You can spend money on lunchboxes, which are this game's equivalent of loot boxes, and you'll also get those as rewards for quests sometimes, and sometimes you'll get them as rewards for the daily missions and such like that. And whenever you open one, you'll just get a random assortment of things, whether it be junk items, or weapons, or outfits, or just caps. And sometimes you'll even get special dwellers, which are just particularly well-statted and sometimes air quotes iconic characters, mostly from Fallout 4. Sometimes it'll even just include a bunch of the standard resources, which are effectively useless for you because you're producing those already, so I don't really know why they put them in there other than just to annoy the player. Aside from the loot boxes, there are also pet carriers that you can get, which will give you random pets. It's basically a loot box, but it's limited to pets. And then there is Nuka-Cola Quantum, which is the game's effective premium currency, and it is used to skip timers, and nothing else. You'll sometimes get Nuka-Cola Quantum without having to pay for it by going and completing quests and such, but apart from one particular instance where they're teaching you what it's about, you don't really need to worry about it too much. It's just set something on the timer and then just turn the game off and go do something else. That's basically what they've designed here. It is just a game where you set timers up and then you walk away and go do something else. And while I know that's a fairly normal thing in the mobile gaming space, it's impossible to shake the feeling that it is utterly pointless. There is nothing to this supposed game. There is nothing really to do in it, and when you start messing around with it, you very quickly realize that. Weirdly enough, it's designed to try to siphon money out of the player by annoying them into spending money on stuff like the Nuka-Cola Quantum so they can skip timers, but all the game is just timers. So if you're skipping the timers, then what exactly are you doing in Fallout Shelter? Well, nothing. I mean, at least the Elder Scrolls Blades, even though it has the whole timers thing going on too, actually has gameplay. You're going and doing dungeon crawling, you're fighting monsters and such like that. Fallout Shelter, on the other hand, just has nothing going for it. It is entirely just trying to siphon money out of the player by annoying them with timers. Only once you get past the timers, there's nothing to it other than the Fallout license, and that's not remotely enough to carry it. As such, there is absolutely no reason anybody, not just Fallout fans, but anybody at all, should ever play Fallout Shelter. It's just pointless. There are so many other things you could be doing with your time. And the sad part is that as awful as the Elder Scrolls Blades was, I can still recommend it over something like this, because at least Elder Scrolls Blades is actually a video game. This, on the other hand, is just a pointless time waster and yet another instance of Bethesda not only fundamentally misunderstanding the Fallout license, but just dragging it down further into the mud. And honestly, that's really the only reason I took a look at this in the first place, is just because it's Fallout. And I feel obligated to cover all of the Fallout games at this point. Even the terrible ones, even the things that are trying to pass for games but are just pointless time wasters like this. So thank you all very much for watching. If you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.